All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Kiana Irvin of the Department of History here at MU. The African American Experience in Missouri is a lecture series that explores the history of Black Americans in Missouri from the earliest period of statehood to the present. And our effort is a collaboration of the State Historical Society of Missouri, the Missouri Humanities Council, and the University of Missouri's Division of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity. Dr. Gary Kramer, the Executive Director of the State Historical Society of Missouri, is my colleague in this endeavor, and together with Mary Ellen Lohman, also of the State Historical Society, we have invited a total of 10 scholars so far. We would like to extend, of course, our deepest thanks and gratitude to all of our many, many supporters. Thanks especially to the staff of the State Historical Society, the Missouri Humanities Council, and the Office of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity. We have one more lecture series, or lecture for this particular semester. That is Patrick Huber. He's a professor of history at Missouri University of Science and Technology. He'll present his work on the St. Genevieve race riot of 1930, and that lecture will take place on November 14th at 6:30 p.m. in this room. Now tonight, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Delia Gillis, who is professor of history and the director of the Center for Africana Studies at the University of Central Missouri. Earning her PhD in history from the University of Missouri, Columbia, Gillis is an expert in 20th century African American history, the history of African American women and girls, and African Americans in Kansas City, as well as the digital humanities and African American public history. She teaches a wide range of very neat courses, including Introduction to Africana Studies, African American History, also African American Women's History, Gender and Civil Rights, and the Social History of the American Family. Dr. Gillis is the author of numerous publications, including Kansas City, which is a pictorial history of African Americans published by Arcadia, Truth in Black Ink, Lucille Bluford's Call to Pen for Black Feminist Activism, which appeared in the Jackson County Historical Society Journal in the fall of 2006, and the forthcoming essay, Sapphires Gone Wild, The Politics of Black Women's Respectability in the Age of the Mean Girl, which she co-wrote with Dr. Deanna J. Reese, another graduate of Mizzou's PhD program in history. Dr. Gillis was a member of the board of directors of the Warnall Majors House Museum and the Black Archives of Mid-America. From 2013 to 2015, she was the project director for Created Equal, America's Civil Rights Struggle, which was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History. She is the past chair or president of numerous organizations, including the Africana Studies area of the Southwest Texas Popular Culture and American Culture Association, the Missouri Conference on History, and the Lorraine Williams Leadership Award Committee of the Association of Black Women Historians. Dr. Gillis will sign copies of her book after the question and answer period. I encourage you to purchase one if you can. So please welcome her to the podium.
Thank you, Dr. Irvin, for that warm welcome, and I thank you all for coming out this evening so I can share a little bit of some of the work that I've done on Missouri history, even though my career is now taking me in a different direction, given the title of Sapphires Gone Wild. That really didn't have anything to do with Missouri. Before I begin, I also want to thank Dr. Gary Kramer for his work on his lifetime work on African Americans in this state and putting together this lecture series, and everyone who worked behind the scenes, especially Mary Ellen Lohman, in making this possible. So tonight, I am so delighted to see so many students here. If I call on you, I know you're here for extra credit. I thought I would just be talking with other historians. But it worked out perfectly. Because I wrote Kansas City really because of my students. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about the impetus for writing Kansas City, its 10th anniversary. I'm kind of delighted I still get a small check ever so often for royalties after 10 years. And like I said, my work is going in a different direction. I'm leading study tours to Jamaica. I just took a study tour to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, another study group to St. Louis this weekend for an excellent exhibition on St. Louis civil rights history. So my work's a little bit differently. But it is very much informed by Patricia Hill Collins, who's actually a sociologist and the author of a book, Black Feminist Thought, that I have used since I started teaching the course in 1994. And I remember taking a group of students to KU, hearing her speak. It actually snowed during a spring break. And she talked about how even when a work is published, it is still a work in progress. And that's exactly what I feel about Kansas City. 10 years later, I can still go back to different images and think about so many stories that I was unable to include and so many stories that need to be told. So why Kansas City and why pictorial history? Also informed by the work of historian Deborah Willis, because when we look at the African American story, if we follow the traditional historical notions of history in the last century, you have to use the written word. And that automatically hindered the study of African American people, a people who were prohibited, who would be killed if they learned how to read and write. And so to say that we can only tell a story because of the written record was very limiting. And so to have any images that exist of this past is always just a gem. And that statement of a picture is worth 1,000 words is so apropos. And finally, when I go through some slides this evening, I'm going to focus on just one aspect of the over 200 and some images, and I'm going back to some work done by historian Darlene Clark Hine about looking at the African American professional class, looking at the middle class prior to the civil rights movement. And you guys can raise your hands if you want, or smile or not, but the civil rights movement is so much more than Martin Luther King and so much more than Rosa Parks. And we just didn't snap our fingers and suddenly they appeared and, slavery was over. We had Dr. King, we had President Obama, and it's over. There is so much more to the story, and particularly how over time a middle class was built, a leadership class that was built in order to make those particular highlights of American history so familiar to you. So Kansas City. When I left the University of Missouri, I graduated in 1996, but prior to that, I had already taken a position at our sister campus, the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And obviously I had some really great professors, Dr. Arva Strickland, building is named after him, Dr. Robert Weems, Sundiata Chajua, Dave Roediger, Susan Porter Benson, Carolyn Dorsey, and Jean Allman. So I left thinking, I know everything I need to know about African American history. And I arrived in Kansas City to what happened? Why didn't they tell me about all of these other people who had done so much to push forward the African American agenda? Freedom Incorporated, a political organization that still exists today, founded in the pre-voting rights era in Kansas City, had heard nothing about it. And Dr. Chajua had us read everything under the sun. So part of my education began again as a professor in the classroom, teaching students like yourself, wanting to engage them in the local history. So really this book is an homage to everything that I learned over about a period, so a 10-year period. So when I had the opportunity to do the book, my first, and it's in the introduction, I'm like, oh my God, where am I going to find 200 images, 200 photographs. So I thought it was a really daunting task. A year later, by the time I'm having to send the book to press, I'm like, oh my God, I have so many photographs. Which ones do I leave out? So it became a conscious decision that each and every image in the book had multiple meanings, because I did not want to leave anyone or anything out. I would have to say that after 10 years, when I look at it, I'm still pretty satisfied with it. I think there are a couple of things I would change. Most of those things I would change because there have been more collections of images that have come out since it was first published. But overall, I was satisfied with the book, particularly when local historians like Sonny Gibson or people in Kansas City tell me, you got my story right, because I'm not a native Kansas Cityan. And so there was a feeling that I had of that I was entrusted with this community story, and I wanted to make sure it was something that they felt comfortable with. On the one hand, I have my historian peers who critique it and what they thought mattered, but this was a community story, and it was very important to me that they felt like it was their story. So let's begin. So this evening, what I decided to do, out of those over 200 and some images that were in there, I wanted to focus on this concept of business, culture, and power, and looking at Kansas City's professional class. Even with the cover photo that was selected, I had sent 2 photographs to my publisher, and the particular photograph that they chose is a National Urban League dinner. And the National Urban League is a major organization in the early 20th century, providing economic assistance and education in America's urban core. National Urban League still exists. The other photograph that I had sent was particularly, and this photograph, this image comes from a collection at the Missouri State Archives, who holds a complete collection from the 1930s, 40s, 50s of the Urban League. So that was really worth the trip to Jeff City. The other image that I had sent, which is one of my favorite images in the book, and especially given the renaissance around the institution, just tells you how important it was. The image was from the Schomburg, and the Schomburg is an African-American repository connected to the New York Public Library, but it was the grand opening celebration of the Paseo Ymca. And it was just an absolutely beautiful image of African Americans celebrating, this community center. And it became so much more than a Y. The fact that they had pulled together teachers, morticians, every walk of life in that community to provide the matching funds to have the YMCA. And in fact, today, that YMCA has been named after a Kansas City legend, the late Buck O'Neill, and it's going to be an educational center. So it's seeing this revitalization. And so that was just part of the process in terms of the kind of concentrated and detailed and thoughtful things that were going through my mind in selecting which images would be included. So for this evening, to talk a little bit about one of the 5 sections in the book, I should also change the title just slightly, because this is going to be through the eyes of Ada and Chester Franklin. And so it's kind of, we know Martin Luther King, we know Rosa Parks, but sometimes we have to revisit these individuals for really the wealth that they offer us. Okay, so this is an image of 18th and Vine circa 1920. 18th and Vine is a historic corner memorialized in song. It was the community in which jazz would take off. A few blocks down the road is where Chester Franklin would establish the Kansas City Call newspaper, a black newspaper that will be 100 years old in 1919, and it still publishes. It still publishes to this day. So when I think about the black professional class in the early 1920s, Two people that will come to mind are Ada and Chester Franklin. Chester is the founder of the newspaper, but he, in 1925, married Ada Krogman Franklin. She came from a very prominent family. Her father was Dr. Krogman. He was an educator and became the first African-American president of Clark University, which is today Atlanta University. So that may seem odd to some of you. It's an African-American university. Why wouldn't you have an African-American president? It just didn't actually work that way at the time. And so the fact that he ascended to that level and served for about 7 years was very significant. Her father, Mr. and Mrs. Franklin, are what we call race men and women. They were individuals who fought for the uplift of African Americans. So when you're looking at the World War I period, whether you call it that, whether you call it the progressive era, or whether you call it the nadir, as historian Rayford Logan, because it was a low point for African Americans. You see these very well-dressed individuals in this photograph. They're educated, they're cultured, but on the other hand, it's a period in which African Americans were lynched. It's a period of when Birth of a Nation is shown, and even shown in the White House. It's a period of time when President Wilson took us backwards by segregating parts of the American federal government that was desegregated, and everyone was working together quite nicely. And so you have those different aspects of the period. In particular, if you're looking at these images, there are some things that are important. You will notice the dress, that she's wearing pearls. These are kinds of things that indicate their status. I don't have that particular image of her in my book, but I did choose that particular image of Mr. Franklin, but because despite their status and wealth, they still remained in the segregated community. Now, part of that was force. Part of that they had no choice about for a period of time. But even when segregation ended and they had the opportunity, particularly Mrs. Franklin, to move out of the segregated community, they chose not to. Mr. Franklin dies in the early 1950s. Mrs. Franklin lives until about 1983, and she remained in the segregated community, living in an apartment above their newspaper. Part of the story also has to do with the women, because there are three women who are inextricably, that are very connected to Chester Franklin, besides his wife, his mother Clara, because it is his mother Clara that gives him the first loan to start the newspaper and works side by side with him. And so these are some images of his mother and with Mr. Franklin. And again, if you notice a few things. One, the fact that we have a photograph to begin with tells you something about the standing of the individual. And then when you take a look at the dress, it speaks again to their status. So these are things that the images can tell us, even if I don't have necessarily any written word about that. And another photograph of Clara Franklin in later years. It's unidentified from the collection, but again, you can see she's a stately woman with a hat, with jewelry, posing. Okay, so going back to the marriage of Chester and Ada, when you are the fact that we have a wedding invitation, their wedding did not take place in Kansas City. It actually took place in Philadelphia, and it was a society event. And in the collection, most of the images that I'm using this evening come from the Black Archives of Mid-America, where I served on the board for about 8 years. And so these are some of the things that we have in the collection, are the actual invitation from their wedding. And they're beautiful, beautiful wedding images. Again, it speaks to their class and their status, the tucks and tails, and her dress in particular. So it was not a shotgun wedding. It wasn't something that was done in the courthouse or in the backyard. It was in an event for the season. The Franklins were also very devoted to their family, even though we do not know who these individuals are by name. We know they are part of their family. We also know through the letters that they are very close to their family. This particular letter is from a nephew to Uncle Chester, so you have that particular relationship. In our collection at the Black Archives, we also have letters between Ada Krogman Franklin and her father. And then we also have love letters between Chester and Ada. And I always like to talk a little bit about their love letters because, we don't write anymore. We tweet, we Snapchat. And these letters give us a window into the love affair of the Franklins that was really not only based on their personal relationship with each other, but their love for their community and their commitment as a couple to that uplift. And I want to, put that into perspective because if you look at the letters for Bess and Harry Truman, those letters are a little different because Mrs. Truman's mother never liked Harry and never thought that Harry was good enough for her daughter even after he became president. And President Truman wrote letters, and it's my understanding, the letters that have been lost, but you don't see necessarily the same kind of affection. And so these are two couples during a comparable time period. So having the letters from the family members, having the letters that the Franklins shared amongst themselves, again, indicating their stature. Now, they originally met when Mrs. Franklin was traveling the country before she began her career with the newspaper with her husband. She was an educator. She taught in Alabama and also in Tennessee. But one of the things that she is very famous for, one thing that I would love to see a theater department do is bring back milestones. Milestones of a Race. It was a pageant where Mrs. Franklin had written the script from Africa, from Egypt, to the present. And what was very significant about Milestones was that she went to each community and used it, almost as a community activity. They raised the actors and actresses from each and every community. And so I don't know, you guys are a little bit younger. I don't know if you know, but the Ebony Fashion Fair, for those who are older in the audience, they may remember how the fashion show would go from city to city. What is important about this is taking place in the early 1920s, and this predates something that we will see during the Great Depression with the New Deal arts programs. And so I'm not saying that she necessarily influenced it or that they learned that from her, but she was doing this in the 1920s. And so pageants, we have lots of images of pageants, of the various pageants in the collection. There are also newspaper clippings from Ohio to Kansas where people had reviewed Milestones. And that was originally how they met when she had come to Kansas City and had put on Milestones. And this is another scene from the pageant. Now, at the Kansas City Call, where Mr. Franklin was the editor, he was a lifelong Republican. But for the young folks here, Republican during this particular time may look more closer to a Democrat today. It's a little bit reversed. So a little bit different. He was a lifelong Republican. He was not above using salacious, your kind of TMZ news type headlines to sell newspapers. But by the time we get to the 1920s, he is publishing almost, I believe it's second. Only the Chicago Defender, a major African American newspaper, is publishing at a higher rate than Mr. Franklin. And it is very important. There's another newspaper, The American, that's being published. It doesn't last. As I said, this newspaper, even though it's not at the same level, still publishes almost 100 years later. Besides the newspaper, the Franklins were very active in the community, as were other middle-class African Americans. One of those spots of activism was the Wheatley Providence Hospital. If you're from the St. Louis area, the Homer G. Phillips Hospital might be a fair comparison. But the Wheatley Hospital was an African American hospital. What made this hospital pretty significant was it was not only a hospital, but it was a training ground for nurses. This particular image is in front of the hospital, and it's auxiliary. And I will never forget that a paper a student wrote for me early on when I was at UMKC was that she was kind of comparing the different auxiliaries. And she was like, wow, the white auxiliaries, they did things like, buy flowers or do things to beautify the hospital. And that's great. But people like Minnie Crossway and women in this auxiliary were raising money to the tune of paying the mortgage and keeping the lights on. So just kind of a bit of a difference in the role that these auxiliaries would play. And I do believe social worker Minnie Crossway is seated in the middle. So when we look at the Black professional class, one of the things that I've noticed is that by and far, most of the leaders did not come from Kansas City or even the state of Missouri. Mrs. Krogman Franklin was born in Atlanta. Mr. Franklin, born in Texas, had traveled to Omaha and Denver and finally made Kansas City his home. Dr. J.E. Perry, who's the most prominent physician connected with the hospital, was also not from Kansas City. Mrs. Crossway, the first social worker in Kansas City, was from Tennessee. So that was one of the things that I've noticed in looking at the African American professional class at the beginning of the 20th century. They come for the opportunity and make important contributions to their new home. The other organization in which the Franklins were extremely supportive was the Paseo Ymca. Again, there was a huge building fund effort. Many African American business people involved, including Mr. Watkins of the Watkins Family Funeral Home of the time, teachers, educators in the African American community in this period of time, and even today, despite their low pay, educators in the African American community are always a part of that Black professional class, not because of the money they make, but their stature and their role in educating the community. This is the call letterhead, and as I said, for nearly 100 years, this is the letterhead that has fought for justice and equality. So despite the fact that the paper is doing well, Roy Wilkins, who later becomes a very important civil rights leader, works with Mr. Franklin and really pushes him along with Mrs. Franklin to make sure that they're covering more serious political issues in the Kansas City Call. And I think if you go back and historically look at most African American newspapers or magazines, a Ebony magazine or a Jet magazine from 1950 is a very different publication from what you see today. There's a lot more that is based on education, culture, politics, as opposed to just popular culture news. The Kansas City Call was a business, and so part of being a business meant that it provided jobs for individuals in the community. And carrying the Kansas City Call paper was a really important job. I don't know what the equivalent of that would be. I don't know if some of you are delivering for Amazon for the holiday, a Uber driver, but being a part of the Kansas City Call was something that was very respectable and coveted for young people. And this is a image of some of the Kansas City Call representatives who go out and get subscriptions. Again, if you think about the first image, I'm always struck by when I'm looking at the 1920s and the 1930s, and you read in your textbooks about the Depression and how horrible it is. I'm always excited to see these images of people at these formal dinners, the formal menus that they had, the refined way, going to the ballpark in heels and dresses and hats, and the more casual nuances of today's life. And so this particular image of the Kansas City Call, I believe it's at about a 40th anniversary of the paper. It's after Mr. Franklin's death, indicates that they also had those types of functions, and it was also something that the Call, it was just not a business, it was a part of the community, and you were a part of the Call family. So we have Ada Krogman Franklin, who brought her East Coast background, her refinement to Mr. Franklin. We had Claire Franklin, his mother, who had given him some of the funds to begin his work. And then you have Lucille Bluford. And Lucille Bluford takes over the reins and had been a part of the Call since the 1930s. And this is a photograph of her in 1989. She passed in 2003. But Lucille Bluford was really what some of you would know from your classes in terms of being an investigative journalist. In the 1940s, she was in the Boot Hill covering a lynching. So if you think of a young woman covering such a heinous crime, she has great ties to this institution, though she never attended the University of Missouri. Ms. Bluford is responsible ultimately for the desegregation of the journalism school, and they have honored her on not one but two occasions. They turned her away in 1950. So while she's, if you think about your own life, while she's busy working, doing her newspaper job, she's filing lawsuits against the University of Missouri in her free time with the help of NAACP attorneys. She graduated from the University of Kansas in the 1920s. And one of the things that I wrote about Ms. Bluford in my book, I took a quote from Congressman Emanuel Cleaver. He was mayor at the time. But when there were no representatives, when there were no mayors, when there was no formal political voice for Kansas Cityans, they had Lucille Bluford. Lucille Bluford was the person who could go in between the races and try and push for justice and equality. And there's a beautiful article about her, again, here at the university from the summer, as a testament to the role that she played decade after decade after decade. And she took over in the editorial role after Wilkins left in the early 1930s. While this picture is from 1950, the Kansas City Call still sits at the corner of Woodland and 18th Street, about 3 blocks from the image that I showed you at the very beginning of my talk of what it looked like in the 1920s. This is what it looked like in the 1950s, and actually the building really has not changed very much even in 2017. But it's still a living testament to the lives that these individuals lived and fought for in this particular community. Thank you for listening. The images are courtesy of the Black Archives of Mid-America, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
We have plenty of time for questions and answers. I see a lot of faces that I know, but I won't call on you, I promise.
You mentioned the African-American professional class coming from other areas outside of Kansas City. Did you find a lot of these individuals, I know you mentioned New York, did you find a lot of these individuals were potentially coming from the South?
Right, they're generally come, and that, because I'm originally from Virginia and moved here and was transplanted, that always caught my eye whenever I've been doing any research and seeing the biography of different leaders. They were not necessarily born and raised in Kansas City. They migrated here during a period of time that gave them greater economic, opportunity, just like the jazz musicians who are going to travel through Kansas City. So yes. Almost without fail, the vast majority of them did, even though you do have some not that are from Kansas City. Another aspect of that that causes, that out-of-state influence is the fact that African Americans could not go to graduate school in the great state of Missouri. And so that also meant that a lot of leaders that you had within your community ended up being educated in Iowa, Chicago, New York, and other places. But by and large, we're looking at the Upper South, even though I'm thinking of a leader now, Mrs. Yates, she came from Rhode Island. So they come from a wide variety of places.
You talked about how a lot of times people miss a big part of the civil rights movement, and people just see it as like Dr. King and other people like that. And a big part that people often miss is the fight for economic and professional equality. So how do you think the city of Kansas City or Missouri as a state as a whole kind of has progressed in that equality, kind of like compared to the rest of the country, if that makes sense?
Well, yes and no. I've always felt comfortable living in Missouri coming from Virginia because it felt the same. Because and I speak from the fact that I'm born in 1965. I consider myself a civil rights baby because it's only within my lifetime that all of the laws basically were changed. So I'm a part of that first generation that has an opportunity to experience, equality. When I look at, for example, at St. Louis has always been considered a northern city in a southern state. I think when we look at Kansas City, you see a crossroads of kind of that west. You see different levels of segregation. So you have residential segregation in Kansas City. People could not move past certain lines. I think some of it has changed, but some of it has not changed. If we look at the 1950s and look at the level of economic equality between the races, it was actually closer than it is now. So some things have improved and some things have not improved. If we look at the 1930s, it is a period of time where we have, some of the largest numbers of African American owned businesses, something that is not the case today in 2017. So certainly we've made great progress, but there are some things, particularly when we look at the persistence of poverty and an underclass. And I really speak with that conviction because one of the things I was doing this weekend was taking a group of my students to St. Louis, and we watched a film called For a King. It's getting a lot of national attention, but it's a documentary about a young woman. She's a teen mother, just living in poverty. And so we have generations of Americans who have never had real opportunity. And so you begin to have generation after generation. And that level of economic distress, unfortunately, is a really strong indicator of what your future is, no matter what you do. And I think that's what's heartbreaking, that even if you do everything you can, if you're not afforded opportunities, your life won't change.
You make an interesting point about the lines of segregation and where they were drawn. And it's my understanding in Kansas City at one time, folks could not, or black folks could not move south of 27th Street. What I find also interesting to help put this into some geographical perspective, your numbered streets in Kansas City The lower numbers are in the north, and then as the numbers increase, you go south. When you think of that, the seat of government and power in Kansas City was around 13th Street, 10th Street, downtown. Whereas you move 5 or so blocks south, and you have the heart of the black community at 18th Street and between 18th and 27th. So just to help put that into some geographical perspective.
Correct, and that was just not always the case. Originally, that area was not African American, but over time, as other immigrant groups, move up economically and move out, that southern line increases to 27th. Actually, when I was on faculty at UMKC, I had a home in the 50s, which is an extremely poor neighborhood. I was moving in as a part of a rehab effort to rebuild the university. And I remember going to the city directory, and actually it was, kind of a Jewish community in the 1950s, but by the time you get to 2000, it is a predominantly poor African American section. There were enclaves of African Americans that lived in other parts of the city, but when we're talking about the black professional class in particular, you're looking at that 22nd, 23rd Street to 27th. They had these particular areas where they had some of the larger homes. If anyone is familiar, for example, with the Santa Fe neighborhood in Kansas City, some of those homes were in that area.
Going back to the call, and you talked about how they had some TMZ-esque headlines,
Yes.
and then how Bluford kind of pushed them more towards investigative journalism. What do you think it says about the changing of the times that, shifting from Wilkins to Bluford, they went into the more investigative direction, and about the call itself?
Well, there's always that business, and not to be too political, we're paying a price right now because the media decided they needed some headlines this summer, and they went for headlines. I think there was a balance in trying to have headlines, if it bleeds, it leads, to have to earn the money. At the same time, when you have Wilkins and Ada Krogman saying, we need to deal with some of these issues, our editorial columns, and so he began to have a balance of both. And certainly because Lucille Bluford was educated and trained as a journalist, because she was educated at Lincoln High School, where she had a very serious journalism teacher that really impacted her. They brought those particular aspects to the Kansas City Call paper, and so you can see their influence in that.
What was the size of the circulation size of the call? And the reason why I'm asking is because the call is the first black paper to have verified circulation, meaning that it was reaching out to advertisers saying, these are how many people we're reaching. So what was the circulation size?
At the period of time when Wilkins was on staff, that transition, we were looking at about 20,000. It was only second to the Chicago Defender at that time. And also sometimes it's a little frustrating when you're doing call research because you had like the Texas edition, so there'd be these different editions. But at that point, it was 20,000.
I had a similar question about location. I noticed the logo that you showed had the 4-state area, and I always thought of the call being from Kansas City. I thought of it as a community thing there.
Nope.
Did it go? Was it distributed?
Yes,
throughout?
it was distributed, and that's what I was saying. You'd have, and you still do. You have like the Kansas version. You have your online version. There's like the Oklahoma, Texas version. They had different versions of the call to cater to that particular readership.
Hi, my name's Jeff. I'm doing a dissertation actually on Kansas City history during the World War I era, so this
Okay.
is really interesting. And I just had like kind of a political question about like racemen and the local politics, because like before the 20s, there's a Republican machine, there's 2 Democratic Party machines,
Okay.
and you have reformers in both parties. So I'm kind of wondering, like among the racemen, some were tied to the Republican Party and some were tied to the Democratic Party. How much those kind of local political divisions hampered cooperation among them or not?
Well, I'm not much of a political historian of the period. When I'm working on the World War I period, I'm looking more at how African Americans fought in World War I and came back to rebuild the community. People like Homer Roberts, who had the first African American automobile dealership, not here, but in the entire country, or Homer Jap Eblon, who built the Eblon Theater, which was an exquisitely designed and built piece of architecture. To me, in my readings, I don't necessarily see a lot of conflict to the extent that it stops them from doing what they need to do. What I'm seeing, whether it's the YMCA or the hospitals, I'm seeing a great deal of cooperation. That's not to say there was not the political squabbling, but what I see from that aspect, it didn't seem to affect it. But Dr. Kramer might offer a different perspective.
Just very briefly, there is a big split, and it's in the newspapers. The Call is a Republican newspaper. The American is the Democratic newspaper. The American is the newspaper that, in fact, Pendergast subvents. He provides the money for, and the publisher is an African-American doctor, William J. Tompkins, who's the superintendent of what was called General Hospital No. 2. So there is a real split. There is a division, and in fact, I would argue that it really does hamper African-American political struggles in the 20s because of this split. And Kansas City, in fact, I'm glad you're working on this, because I would argue Kansas City is, in fact, on the cutting edge of the cities that the black population moved from Republican to Democrat before anybody else in the country.
I just had a question about, like, how politically radical was the newspaper able to get? Like, were they able to be as radical as to publish, like, the testimonies of black women and sexual assault, or did they have to stay, like, more moderate because of maybe communist or socialist associations?
Well, no. I would not say they were as radical as being communist, but when you look at coverage of the lynching that I mentioned, when you look at the way that they raised money for World War II bonds, to me they are, radical in that sense, because they are pushing forward the agenda of the community. But they're not radical like an A. Philip Randolph, who in the early 1920s is saying, forget this country, we're not going to fight in World War I, we have grievances here. So, and how you're defining, that radicalism, no, I would not say they were.
So I noticed that you said that both the Franklins lived in a segregated community, and during that time, they also stayed in the segregated community even though they had the opportunity to leave. While they were in that situation, I guess I would say, did they ever kind of run into any altercations or just kind of racial violence just because they were of such a high stature during their time?
Not that I can think of. I think part of being a part of that black professional class was it gave you a level of insulation. I think one of the things that I have learned over time in interviewing different community elders, because, I just really had this notion of how horrible, it's so horrible, and you think of the images of dogs being sicked on people in the water hoses of the 1950s. But one of the things that community elders like Irene Marcus and others have said was that it provided a level of insulation because they went to their churches, their schools, their stores. So even though there were these boundaries and limits within that community, what they remember, Dr. Yvonne Wilson, former state senator, what they remember is a community that loved them, that expected much from them, that notion of that proverbial village when I do, have different conversations and interviews. So in terms of like racial profiling or being pulled over, that kind of thing, no. Did it happen to others? Yes. There's a huge story when a couple does move outside of this specific geographical range where like their house is firebombed. So yes, it does happen, but not necessarily to someone like Ada and Chester Franklin. Might they suffer those kind of what we call today microaggressions in certain situations? Perhaps.
Okay, I was just thinking a lot about Black Wall Street and that whole idea that when you have a Black community thriving, there are usually pushback and people who obviously want to tear that down. So that's what.
That's true, but 18th and Vine is a little bit more complicated than that because it was a place where whites came and enjoyed the entertainment. Whites owned stores. As Dr. Kramer indicated, the Pendergrass machine, is funding the paper. So there's a more interconnectedness. There's a level of oversight, even control, if you will, in some aspects. And so it's a little bit different from Black Wall Street.
So we have time for maybe 3 more questions or so.
When you were writing the book, did you find it hard to narrow down the different perspectives since you really mentioned just one with Franklin and his wife?
Can you ask me that again?
So when you were writing the book, did you find it hard to narrow down everybody's perspectives, with Franklin and his wife? You mentioned them, but was there other people that you didn't include in the book that you thought were also significant?
Well, yeah, as I said, there were a couple that probably didn't make it into the book because I was not maybe aware of them at the time, or I couldn't find an image or a document that we could use. Overall, I think of the 200 and some images that are in the book, I think I'm pretty pleased with. I think some of the changes I really would want to make are in the earlier part. Now that I've been on the board of the Warner Majors home, working their slaves' narratives into the story would have been important. Some of the things that I did later in the book, I'm really pleased to see, for example, that Attuck School was a school that educated a lot of the African American middle class, and it's just sitting in the district empty. Basically, it's a parking lot for special events, and there was recently a contract given to a Chinese company to redevelop it and restore it. So that was one of the images that I put in my book to say, someone do something about it. I don't know if they ever saw my book, but I'm just so happy to see that, a change is being made. As for other people, I did deal with other individuals at this level in the book, Minnie Crosswaite, the social worker, Dr. J.E. Perry, a physician, his wife, Frederica Douglas Sprague Perry, actually a granddaughter of Frederick Douglass, is in the book. The first Orchid Jordan and, her husband's name just slipped me. The first African-American policeman in the book, Bruce Watkins. Watkins and Jordan were some of the founders of Freedom Incorporated. So there are a lot of individual stories in the book. There are images in the book where we couldn't identify who they were, but those images spoke to whether people working in the industry, the war industry during World War II. There's an unidentified bride and groom in the book because I wanted to highlight not so much the image, but the photographer, because I was highlighting the African-American photographer of the period. Lots of young people, lots of institutions and buildings. So again, I tried to cover as much ground as possible. And then where there were images where we had seen for example, of a baseball player or a jazz singer, there are certain pictures that you would see of them over and over again. I always tried to find a different image of them or a different setting to tell their story. For example, with Charlie Parker, I don't think there's a Charlie Parker image, but there is a Charlie Parker contract that really shows how he got cheated in some of his musical earnings. So those were some of the ways that I tried to tell the story and use a wide variety of images, of documents, using archives, not only in Missouri but around the country to do it.
When you were talking about Lucille Bluford, how was she able to desegregate the journalism school here?
Okay. So when she applied to attend the journalism school, she is following behind Lloyd Gaines, who had set out to desegregate the law school. And we get a very important case in the Gaines case for the law school that Missouri has to either provide a law school for African Americans or he has to attend the University of Missouri. And so what the University of Missouri sets out to do is to create a separate law school. It's actually in St. Louis, and it's an arm of Lincoln University, the African American school. So Lucille Bluford comes behind with her case. Ms. Bluford's is a little bit different because they pull her out of the registrar's line. This was some of my original work as a graduate student. And so in the archives across the street, you will look at the applications, and sometimes they will ask you what your race, and sometimes the applications did not. In Lucille Bluford's case, because it did not ask her race, and because she graduated from the University of Kansas, they didn't know she was black until she was accepted, and she got in line to register for classes. And the registrar took her out of line and said, well, you can't do that. So the court cases ensued, after that. Ultimately, as she said, they had to shut the law school down. So she would have attended the law school, but then World War II happened and they suspended classes in the journalism school because of World War II. So that's why I give her that particular credit in helping to break that down. And then by 1950, Gus Ridgel attends this institution in 1950 and earns his Master's of Economics degree and is the first African American to attend.
One more question then.
Hi. So you talked about the Ebony Fashion Fair, and you mentioned all of the different pageants that were happening. In what ways would you say beauty and fashion industries help to propel African Americans in the area, and also strengthen them in terms of just finding confidence in their ways of dress and their appearance?
Well, I think African Americans are creative innovators, and we are really, as a people, I don't have any rhythm, but as a people, are modeled after, and they're innovators, and then other groups take what they do. If you think about any time you hear a commercial, 9 times out of 10, the background music is some African American artists. I mean, they're pulling out all kinds of music like JCPenney. Here comes the hop stepper. I'm like, wait a minute, we've got this reggae beat, but we're selling JCPenney clothes. So I think creative, and then on the flip side of that, the creativity has given African Americans an outlet to do things, and that art and music and fashion have been outlets, positive outlets for some of the oppression and injustice that one has in the community, taking the least of something and making the most of it, and creating and inventing most of the basic inventions that we use, from the lawnmower to the iron to the stoplight. Have been based on African American inventions, and it just does not get the credit. The Gila cells, for example. So much of kind of the creative genius that makes us American has some basis in African American culture.
Let's thank Dr. Gillis for a wonderful lecture.
Good question.